Mama, mama.
Is that Alas, Poor Dragon, Yorick?
Fine, steal my line. See if I can.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
All right. But
We weren't live yet. You can still use it. I'll let you use it.
This is why I knew that we were going to be friends. I knew that anyway.
Fellow of infinite jest.
We ready? Okay, I think we are, and I'm seeing us online. So I say, alas, poor Drogon. I knew him, Horatio. All right, I'll stop. Hello, everyone. I'm Danita Feldman. I am your moderator for the Sci-Fi and Fantasy and Horror in Theatre panel. And I would love to introduce you to my gorgeous, amazing, extraordinary, fabulous guests and the people in the room. So please introduce yourself, people in the room. We'll start with Bill.
Okay, my name is Bill Rich, and I am the president of the Atlanta Radio Theater Company, who has been trying to revive a moribund art form since 1984. And we're sort of succeeding, and actually the plague has helped us a little bit. We're now performing all over the country and the world virtually. We actually did our first virtual convention at Con Zealand. So that's why we're here this weekend, since we normally stay around the Atlanta, Florida, Chattanooga area.
A plague on all of your radio shows. No.
Audio dramas.
Carrie.
Hi, I'm Carrie Vaughn. I'm an author of quite a few novels and short stories at this point. I have a little bit of a theater background, amateur theater. My brother is the technical director of the theater department at Linfield College, and we've collaborated on a one act, and I'm hoping we'll get to do more collaboration at some point in the near future when our schedules align, which doesn't happen as often as I would like. But yeah, one of these days I'll post all the pictures of me and my musical theater days back in high school, but today is not that day.
Awesome. John.
I'm John Barnes. About or a bit over 30 novels, most of them science fiction, published. Last one was something like 6 years ago, and I'm sort of trying to decide whether I'm retired or not from writing science fiction. I'm a data scientist nowadays to pay the bills, and find that I actually enjoy that a lot. Even better, I'm in the tax industry, so I'm absolutely protected from any form of excitement whatsoever. In my former days, I was a professor of theater at Western State up in Gunnison, and theater historian. And one of my specialty areas was 19th century theater, which is the great heyday of theatrical special effects. I think it is fair to say that everything you have ever seen them do in the movies, somebody managed to do on stage before 1900. So there's a huge, rich tradition of science fiction and fantasy on stage that is now largely forgotten.
Wow. And I am Danita Feldman. I am a professional storyteller, and I have done quite a lot of theater, and I make costumes, and I just love the genre. And one of my favorite roles that I ever got to play was Queen of the Fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So my first question for 10 points. There's been a resurgence of radio dramas of late, and I grew up on radio dramas back on listening to the BBC, and when Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy first came on the radio airs, which probably gives my age away a little bit, but I'm good with that. What is your favorite? Why do you think they're making a comeback? Let's start with John.
I would have to admit that I haven't listened to very much recent material, so I'm going to just say, in all honesty, that I don't have enough encounter with anything since the turn of the century. In college, for one absolute grade point average ruining year, about what grew to a team of about 40 friends, and I put together a 15-minute-a-day radio serial. We had no idea how much work that was going to be. It started as about 5 or 6 people, and and grew into a huge thing by the end of the year. And then nobody wanted to do it the next year because we all needed to pass our classes. So there's a whole lot of things to love about radio drama. And diverging wildly, my favorite artist of the whole thing, I did an article about him for the Oxford Encyclopedia of Theater and Drama, is Frank Napier. Are you acquainted, Bill? Do you recognize the name?
Frank, what was his last name?
Napier, Napier.
No, I don't recognize that name, which I feel ashamed at the moment.
Well, look up his books.
Okay.
He worked in the 30s, but he originated much of the creation of modern sound effects.
Oh,
The guy
okay.
who figured out how to make a creaking door creepy or funny.
Did he do the mayonnaise jar for Inner Sanctum for when they were in the toilet? No, for the War of the Worlds.
I don't believe he ever worked in the States. I think it was entirely at BBC Studios.
BBC, yeah. Well,
but he figured out his whole procedure for creating really marvelous atmospheric sound effects. And indeed, some of his effects are still heard in community theaters all over the planet because BBC put them out eventually on CD.
Which we have their entire sound effects library.
Then you probably used his work.
I am absolutely sure of that.
Cool. Harry.
So I actually have a question to kind of throw out back to that because it's an area that I don't know very much about either. But I would attribute a resurgence into the availability of podcasts and the popularity of podcasts. So can we still call them radio dramas if they're on podcasts? And I'm thinking about things like Night Vale, you know, some of the dramas that have really inspired the popularity and the rise of that format. So what would be the difference between a radio drama and a podcast, and why? I can understand why you would still call a radio drama or a podcast a radio drama, but I'd love to hear a little bit about the nomenclature on that.
Okay, so we have actually been thinking about this for at least 40 years. So we started as the Atlanta Radio Theater Company, and it has the advantage of having the initial spell artsy, and that helps us sort of push our product. But we all are from the generation where we listened to our parents' radio theater when it was being rebroadcast as kids. So like I listened to The Shadow every Saturday afternoon when I was in high school, and that was my introduction to radio drama. And we have knocked around over the years of whether we should be called audio theater, which we call ourselves that, but there's a yearly festival of audio theater called the National Audio Theater Festival, and that calls itself radio drama half the time and audio drama. And there's really nothing. It's basically the theater of the imagination, and that's probably the best thing to call it, but it's not really sellable, but it works really well with science fiction fans. And since we mostly do science fiction and fantasy and horror, audio theater is perfect for us because you don't have to do really big special effects that cost millions of dollars. You just start mashing together sound effects, and you can scare the crap out of people entirely by doing that. Yes, someone says The Shadow knows. Weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Yes. The Shadow's great. So yeah, I don't think there's a difference. The podcast people are significantly younger than I am, and we have a daily 5 to 15 minute podcast that we do, but it's very low key, and it's about people surviving the zombie apocalypse, and it's all about hope. So we do that every single day, and we're insane, and very few people do that. And then we have our big epics that we do at conventions, where we do a lot of music and sound and strum and drang all over the place. And it's as interesting to watch because you see people hitting these big hammers against a sheet of metal to make the thunder, and musicians on stage and things like that. So we have both the visual things when we do it live on stage, and then we just release things on CD, and now we do podcast it there. So I don't know if there's any real distinction between what the words mean.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that, because as long as you're using your imagination rather than visual cues, I think it still applies. It's just like Bill was saying, the nomenclature has changed because the technology has changed, and we're still consuming the media. I mean, if you go onto the BBC radio station, which you can get to online now, they still have all of these dramas available. I found the Mysteries of Udolpho as a dramatization. And I don't know how you would even begin to start putting that onto stage because of the technical difficulties of dealing with that, although it kind of runs into the realm of melodrama, that particular play. But we've been doing sci-fi and fantasy on stage since the 1800s. Like when I was researching for this, I was finding really old examples of plays that were put on stage that were very whimsical. And, you know, you could even argue, what's that, John?
I was going to say, there was a huge vogue for what were called the Gothic melodramas.
Oh, yeah.
That starts around 1815, runs till about 1840. So it's 25 years. It's, you know, it's as long as, say, Star Wars or Star Trek was at peak popularity. So it's a wave as big as that. And again, there was, for a variety of reasons that we can go into or not, there was nothing you couldn't do as a special effect in those days. There was the notion of you can't do that on stage. I mean, you know, just wasn't true. There's
sheer ingenuity, yeah.
Yeah.
And the audience's imagination helps you a lot.
Yeah.
Well, so what would you given that, which is a history I don't know very much about and I'm really fascinated with, because it goes back even further than that, of course. It goes back to Shakespeare and the Elizabethans, who were obsessed with magic and fairies and ghosts and things. But so there's been a vogue on Broadway over the last 10 years or so to kind of do huge epics. And I'm thinking about all of the trials and tribulations of the Spider-Man musical. So it's so interesting to hear you talk about special effects when that was a show that was kind of famous for doing it badly. You know, they were having accidents with their flying equipment and the rigging and all of that. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, like, I'm just here asking questions. So what would you say to that there are people who are trying to do special effects on stage now that are having problems with it?
Well, look at The Lion King as a good example of a success.
Yeah, but they are trying. Part of it is the anybody here besides me ever encounter Art Widner, passionate theater and film history guy, and also science fiction fan? He goes, you know, the first time that I met a couple of really old fans in Pittsburgh when I moved there, the first thing they asked me was, is Art Widner dead yet? And at the time he was close to 90. But Widner formulated the law that if you see a special effect before you're about 20, it will never bother you. That is, you know, so, and Widner saw King Kong in his early 20s in its first release. And he because he noticed when he was trying to show a videotape of it to his grandchildren that they saw the wires on the airplanes.
Yeah.
And he couldn't. And in much the same way, to this day, looking at old Star Wars footage, I can't see the black diamonds around the X-Wing fighters. You know, they just
I saw those. I only saw them when they cleaned them up for the special edition and they did the side by side. That's when I started seeing them.
Yeah, and so a part of it was that people, but another part of it is that what makes a special effect on the stage. In fact, this is I wrote the encyclopedia article. I get to define it. What makes an effect special is that it's more than one person's department. You're coordinating something with the lights, something with the sound, something with mechanical devices. And because of the way the human brain works, it thinks it sort of arrives at the simplest possible explanation, which is not that there are 20 technicians backstage doing a coordinated dance, but this all happened together. So, okay, early Gothic, one of the most popular, Varney the Vampire, enormously popular, gave its name to the vampire trap, which was a trap door. It originally one that popped very easily, and later they found it was more effective to do it with a very fast moving turntable. But essentially, whenever the vampire appeared in a cloud of smoke and a flash of light, what they were doing was setting off a small firework and pushing pushing up smoke using that. So it was difficult to see, and the audience had just been partially blinded. And while that happened, the turntable spun around, and suddenly the vampire was there on the other side of the wall. Immensely popular and used for so many other things after that, because playwrights would then write for the effects that they knew that could be done. The Scarecrow, which I think is my favorite of all the examples of the theater, the fantastic. It's Feathertop, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Feathertop story. There really are witches in Salem. They're really bad. A witch brings a scarecrow to life and tries to use it to blackmail a local official by having his beautiful daughter fall in love with the scarecrow. But the scarecrow turns human, and and the plot collapses because of young love and all the rest of that. And so there's this marvelous first scene in it where it's written there in the stage directions: the demon who works for the witch and the witch put together old vegetables and clothing on a stand on the stage, and the witch more or less yells "Alakazam," boom flash, and the scarecrow gets up and walks and is a person. And that's the vampire trap, which every theater was equipped with because there were too many popular plays. You had to have that if you were going to operate a successful commercial theater. Well, so yeah, all that marvelous stuff.
And you mentioned that, and one of the big promoters of crazy theater tricks was Frank Baum. And and he did a version of I looked this up. He did a version of Wizard of Oz on stage that he called radio theater, because they were radiating out effects and things like that. It had nothing to do with audio drama or anything. He just called it radio theater. It was this, back about 1907 or something. And it was all about the way the effects moved away from the stage. So look that up. He was crazy. He was a crazy guy.
Oh yeah. And James Barry with the first productions of Peter Pan and Wendy with the fairies flying all over the place. But it goes back even further than that, because like Harry said, we can go back to Shakespeare, Ariel, and the fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream, and the witches in Macbeth. So we've always had this bent towards the fantastical, towards the magical, and the desire to make it manifest, even if it's only fantasy, really. It's a magic trick, it's an illusion, but we've always been fascinated about that. And I wonder what it is in our human minds, the psychology that makes us really reach out for it, because sometimes it can be truly terrifying. If you think about the first film of the train pulling into the station and people knocking over the tables and chairs to get the heck out of there because they thought it was real and they couldn't differentiate.
1903, yes.
And some of the illusions on stage now, and it's funny because I'm a child of the 70s and I grew up with some of the very beginnings of the special effects things, but going to the theater and seeing recently Wicked and Phantom of the Opera and Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, and sitting there watching the special effects and enjoying them, but watching it from a more observer position and wondering, what are the mechanics of that? Because now I'm interested, because I'm a performer as well. It's like, how did they make that work, rather than, oh my God, Elphaba's flying, that's awesome. I mean, I did that too. And then she sang, which was icing on the cake.
Yeah,
But
flying
you
actors.
don't.
Just a fun mention there, because you know the infamous troubles they've had with the Spider-Man musical, with
Yeah.
the safety issues. Peter Pan actually caused a revolution in theatrical safety, which is why if you are going to do Peter Pan, you must, because your insurance company will force you, you must hire the worldwide monopoly Flying by Foy. They are the only thing that an insurance company will trust, and that's all they do is flying actors.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's quite a
so,
niche.
yeah.
So this is interesting. With my radio company, we also had an occasional theater company that we would do live parody plays at conventions, especially here in the South at Dragon Con and things like that. And we did a play where it was a Harry Potter play, and we wanted a bit where the actors are frozen and start sending magic to each other. And then we wanted to use what was it from the Matrix? They called it Zoom time or something like that. And so what we did was bullet time. Everybody froze on stage. We had 4 ninjas come in, lift the 2 protagonists, the antagonists, up off the stage, and they just rotated around on the stage. And the best part is the audience followed us. And then there was another bit where we threw the doctor's scarf all the way across the stage for Batman to walk up the wall. And here's what happened. The Batman is this thing is just on the scarf is on the stage, and they're walking up the wall because it's the 1960s Batman. And here's what the audience did. They bent over so they could see it as if they were walking out the wall. And we didn't even tell them to do this. It's like the audience is on your side. They will help you.
Wow. It's not science fiction, but I saw a play once. It's called Female Transport, about women convicts shipped to Australia in the 19th century. And a storm hits the ship. This is a little tiny theater. All of the actresses on stage did the Star Trek thing where they lurched. And I grabbed the arms of my seat because I could feel it. I could feel it moving.
Yes. And there was a radio play we were doing where there was supposed to be an invasion of bats. And we had a little bit of that recorded, and we had Foley artists flopping their paper. Well, we had programs that we gave out for this. And when we started doing the bat stuff, everybody in the audience took their playbills and started flapping them. And we started giving them direction from the stage, like cut, and they would cut on cue. It's like the best rehearsed Foley people ever. We're the audience.
Oh yeah, that's and again, this goes all the way back.
Yes, the magic of theater. Yeah.
Yeah, and in so many different ways. That's a lot of the secret of the Shakespearean stage. You know, it's such effects as they did, or as they were able to do, originate from those. A piece of trivia: Shakespeare is the only playwright who has 2 trapdoors named after things in his plays.
Wow.
There's, you know, if you look up that encyclopedia, I was able to catalog about 50 different kinds of traps, but besides the vampire trap. But Shakespeare gets the grave trap, which was the one that was used for Hamlet, and the banquo trap, which is the one that
the ghost comes up out from.
No other playwright gets more than one.
I'm sure he's flattered. But it also reminds me of the English pantomime. It may come as a shock. I lived in England when I was a child, but we used to go to see the pantomimes at Christmas time, and it's a very interactive experience. The actors are up on the stage doing classic fairy tales typically, but the audience, that they break the 4th wall all the time, and the audience is brought in. And I think that that's something magical with traditional sci-fi, fantasy, horror things if they're done in a certain way.
Well, and I wanted to throw out that you don't need special effects to have science fiction and fantasy and horror on stage. You don't need actors flying in and out. You don't need trapdoors. You don't need smoke bombs, and you can still have good science fiction. I haven't seen this play myself, but I want to because my brother's theater did it last year. It's called She Kills Monsters by Qui Nguyen, and it's about Dungeons and Dragons. So it's about a woman her sister has died. She's trying to understand her sister by entering a Dungeons and Dragons manual that she has written. So there's a blurring of reality. There's so many thematic things that I think you can explore, in the science fiction and the science fiction adjacent worlds, that, the idea that you need a big, super spectacular, it's the same debate we've been having about movies, right? Does everything need to be a big Avengers superhero movie, or can you have these nice, quiet, science fictional kinds of stories? And you can do both in the movies. I think you can do both in theater as well.
What was that? There was a great time travel movie called Safety Not Guaranteed. That's just underappreciated, and it has so few special effects. It's all about the way the people work. It's great.
Seascape, Edward Albee, no special effects. You need costumes that that the audience will buy, which doesn't necessarily mean they have to be realistic. You need two sea creatures, but not only is it science fiction, I would argue it's pretty high level intellectual science fiction. It's also pretty close to hard SF. The sea creatures are really plausible beings, biologically and every other way.
Well, the word robot was coined from a play, RUR. So.
Yeah, I actually had to read that in graduate school, which indicates I did something terrible in a previous life.
Yes. Well, did you read it in Czech? That's the important question.
I wasn't Hitler, okay.
But the thing is, we started doing audio theater because we wanted to do these big horror plays and science fiction, and we realized that if you do it all with sound, people will write their own special effects in their brains. And we've done some Lovecraft things, which are truly scary, where all you do is you have various sounds happening at certain parts. And, it's great and cheap, and we can do it on the road. We pick up everything we have and we go and we set up and we perform at a convention, and we take maybe 30 minutes to set up, maybe an hour, and then we tear it all down in 10 minutes. So we can just go from place to place. It's really, really a lot of fun. It's different.
And just a word again, I sincerely, I think you're going to get so many ideas from Napier's books that, make the note, do read that, because I just will put it to excellent use. You think like him. That's what I'm actually telling you.
Now, which book? What was the name? I'm actually writing these things down. I don't write as fast as I should. So,
okay.
Well, don't shoot all over yourself. And John, if you'll please post that in the Pandora Discord channel so that everybody can find it to us. That would be awesome.
Let me see if I can find that somewhere.
Yes, and you don't have to do it right now. So.
Yes.
Okay.
Very cool. So, as far as staging actual brick and mortar theater for sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, what are some of the challenges that you think make it less likely that something like that is going to be staged? Or does it not matter anymore because we have access to all this technology and people have all of these resources that they just didn't have before? They did it anyway, but it was very 70s Doctor Who with toilet roll holders and washing up liquid bottles.
Been there, done that.
I don't think there is a limit. A few years ago, I want to say it was the San Francisco Opera, but I may be wrong there. They staged an opera version of The Fly, the Cronenberg, Jeff Goldblum, The Fly, and they did it as opera.
While I picked my jaw up.
Right.
Wait,
Like I said, I haven't seen
not the Vincent Price one.
Well, in so much as the Jeff Goldblum one is inspired by the Vincent Price one, I suppose. But it seems to me like there are no limits. It's just a matter of how creatively can you stage it. Speaking of Doctor Who, if you're going to bring up the old Doctor Who aesthetic, let's call it, that it's a matter of using the resources you have. Right. They did what they did with what they had, and there's an argument to be made that, especially a show like Red Dwarf, did better when they didn't have a budget, because they were having to do all of these creative decisions, and it maybe, kept them, challenged them creatively, keeping within those boundaries. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to tell anybody that there's any kind of limits, because, even, I've seen Hamlet staged in, bare bones minimalist black box theater, and it is about the imagination, and it is about bringing the audience along with you. When the curtain opens, the audience is yours to lose at that point. So what can you do with that?
I think go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, one of the most effective I've only gotten to see a production of The Scarecrow once. There are a few theaters around the country that do revivals of these things. And the thing that I mentioned where they build the Scarecrow on the stage, the gimmick that is thrown in is that the Scarecrow is only able to maintain his human form because there is a little piece of hell in a pipe that he smokes constantly. And if he were ever to lose contact with that, he would turn back into a pile of rotten vegetables and old clothes.
Did you buy that on eBay?
Yeah. What, the piece of hell or the
the pipe? The pipe. She wants the pipe.
No, the pipe with the piece of hell. Asking for a friend.
Yeah, okay. And so there are 2 points in the play where he one way or another briefly loses contact with it, and it's basically the up the sleeve magic tricks of suddenly there's rotten cucumbers falling out of his sleeves and so on. But at the very end, for love of the girl, he throws the pipe away, and at that point she knows what he's doing and screams no, and he pitches forward on the stage, and she runs up and puts her hand on him, and the nice guy who was saying all along there's something wrong with this fellow, comes up and looks and says he's dead, and she looks up and she, and the direction calls for the actress to turn him over so you can see how heavy it is, and she says, but he's a man.
That sounds like a very bad episode of 90 Day Fiancé.
But the thing about that is that with the special effect is so thoroughly established that this guy should be a pile of rotten vegetables, that the audience feels it's witnessed a miracle.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Of course it's amazing.
That's very inspiring. I mean, that really is. And the thing is, the audience will go along with you. And this is what,
right.
Once again, I've worked with radio theater, I've worked with stage theater, live at science fiction conventions. There was one bit where we were doing effectively a Star Trek parody, and they were saying, well, we want to have the away team and we want to have the bridge team. We want to have them talk to each other. And I was directing this, and it was the first play I ever directed, period. And I said, well, when they're on the planet, we'll just put them on stage left, and we'll put the bridge on stage right. And when we want to switch scenes, we just have the actors freeze, and the audience will just watch them. And that worked. And the audience is your friend. They want to help you. And that's the thing is, and it never occurred to me except that, well, there's no way we can just get people. We had no control of the curtain. We had no control of anything. It was like, Elizabethan theater. You were out on the stage and there weren't nothing there. and especially doing small science fiction conventions, you don't have time to dress anything. You just lug everything out quickly and do with it very little props and very little backgrounds and things like that. And the audience will help you. I think that's the big thing to talk about, is how helpful the audience is.
Absolutely. And especially sci-fi fantasy fans, because we're a family, and we're all wandering into imagination land most of the time. So we're right there with you when you're doing stuff like that. We're getting some great comments in the chat, if you're noticing, and people saying, how people really are with you, and the limitations help drive the story, because it's very easy to use the special effects as a crutch and forget to tell the story. So let me ask you, if we could wave a magic wand and you could have any story that you would want translated onto the stage,
Mm.
what would it be?
That's
Well,
a
I
good
just
question.
had the thought that something like Left Hand of Darkness would make a great stage
Ooh.
play, just because so
Yeah.
much of it is so intellectual, and so much of it is, people relating to each other. You don't necessarily
Yeah.
need that big epic sweep. It's a space opera, it's set on another planet, but it's about people and
Yeah.
people talking to each other. So I think that I think would have a lot of potential.
I agree.
Maybe Canticle for Leibowitz.
Ooh.
Because
Oh,
I was thinking you don't need very many special effects, but a few very good ones would do the job.
And,
yeah.
and that's a great story too. I mean, that's,
Yeah.
and then, I wouldn't mind seeing something like Riverworld, which I know they made as a bad sci-fi channel movie, but I think could work fairly well with just costumes, and the stage is the river, and you could do any part of Riverworld you wanted to, and that would be interesting.
Interesting. Would any of those translate to a musical?
Oh, I think anything can be a musical.
Well,
I
As
have-
has been proven by Phantom of the Opera.
Yes,
have
well,
you seen Bat Boy the musical? Speaking of genre on stage,
I have
isn't
not seen that yet, but
I finally
Beetlejuice the
got to
musical.
see it. It's wonderful. It's much darker than I was expecting. Like I was expecting, tabloid headline made musical. And the first half is like that, and then it gets really, really dark. So just to warn you, it's very firmly in the horror category, but anything can be a musical.
Yep. I wrote a musical once that we performed at DragonCon, a 2.5-hour musical at DragonCon, and it was called Romeo and Ethel, the Pirate's Daughter, and it had and it was a stage play. We had every single Shakespeare play that you learned in high school and college merged together, and very much influenced by Gilbert and Sullivan. So
And Tom Stoppard.
less Tom Stoppard than the rest.
That's from Shakespeare in Love, isn't it? Isn't
Yes.
that the play that
We saw that and
he's
said,
writing?
wait a minute, that would make a great play. Pirates and and everything from Penzance, of course, but we stole from lots of Gilbert and Sullivan.
As you must, as you absolutely must.
Yes.
So we have a question from Michael. Has anyone ever done Fritz Lieber's The Big Time on stage?
I don't know of that.
I don't think so.
I don't know.
But I don't know why not. My first thought there is that would be an interesting project, and I don't see anything undoable about it. Just
Nice. So I don't know that one either. So
now here's one that's kind of a fun thought: Cities in Flight.
Ooh,
that would make a magnificent long, probably a two-nighter. I mean, split over 2 nights, so like 3 hours each night.
Yeah, you can sort of skip the first book and merge a lot of stuff, and then finish up with the Triumph of Time.
Right. Act 1, Scene 1, we see New York lift off the planet and fly away.
Yes.
But you can do it. I mean, that is not an impossible thing to do.
we're getting some comments about Evil Dead the musical and Cannibal the musical.
Mm-hmm.
Repo the Genetic Opera.
Yep.
I mean, the possibilities. I mean, some of it I think is subversive, because they're taking this art form that, at least now, it didn't used to be like this, but at least now theater is kind of seen as highbrow and pretentious. And I think the impulse with some of these like really crazy musical and play ideas is to take that down a notch and to kind of bring theater back to a more subversive, not so polished, not so highbrow realm movie.
Shakespearean theater was extremely subversive, and they had to sneak it past the censors, you know, which was the Crown mostly.
Well, yeah, theater as highbrow is a relatively recent development, and partly having to do with ticket prices, which are not not generally affordable, at least not the big name Broadway conception of theater.
There's also
They've got to pay for all those effects.
Yeah, there's also a structural. There's a structural thing that goes into that. 19th century melodrama was very much for the popular audience. In fact, lots of people who've trying to duplicate this theatrical spaces, you gradually arrive at the conclusion that you had to be in really good seats to be able to hear the actors at all. I mean, it was an almost entirely visual medium because of the volume of noise from many other things in the theater. So it was a lowbrow form. And it was a chain of special effects and tableau scenes and so forth, not unlike present superhero movies, let us say. But once, you get the revolution of making the audience shut up and giving them all seats close to the stage so that they can hear the actors' voices clearly. And that led to a huge revival of Shakespeare and basically of things like that. The modern audience is used to using their ears. They're used to thinking in a way that, but the interesting thing about that is that thinking thing produces more detachment. The classic case is Little Shop of Horrors. The stage version ends with Audrey eating everybody. That's it. I mean, it's this glorious celebration of grotesque violence as the entire population is slaughtered. They tried that with the movie audience, and the test audience just absolutely hated it.
Yeah.
They couldn't take it. It was too, it was too bleak. It was too dark. It was too depressing. And what I would argue is, because with the stage audience, there's a detachment. You're watching a great big rubber puppet, and you can't lose track of that. And therefore, it's hilarious when it eats Audrey and Seymour.
And the original material,
you're rooting for Audrey and Seymour.
Yeah. The original material was so low budget that you could laugh along with it. You didn't think, you knew that this was comedy because it was like watching a bad stage play. You had a lot of actors who were very wooden. The plant was the funniest thing. Jack Nicholson was in it at one of his most wooden days. And so it was such a low budget film, you just could get into it because you weren't expecting anything that was realistic.
Can you still get away with that? With
Sure.
low budget and cheap effects and
It's kitsch when you do it. It's kitsch and camp. But referring back to Bat Boy the Musical, you don't want to go to Bat Boy the Musical and have it look polished. You want it to look trashy. So I think when you do it, it's because you're doing it on purpose.
So what's the next evolution of all of this?
Cooperative online theater, which is, I think, something that's going to be happening a lot more, because we've just got it started on it this year, but it's going to be interesting that people are going to be making sets and individual things, set pieces, and then just getting them merged together. And the difference between a stage play and a TV show is going to be a matter of budget, probably.
I was on the road and couldn't see it, but did anyone see the recent premiere of Sticks and Stones?
No.
Musical, headed for Broadway, serious piece of work, and was shut down because of COVID. And the director, playwright, and the cast, essentially, or the thing had already been cast, figured out a way to do a sort of a virtual staging of it. With everybody performing from their house, including it needed a children's chorus, and they hadn't cast that at the time that they were shut down. So they threw open casting on the thing, and there are stage kids all over the planet. They had 30 kids from 25 nations.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've seen happening, because I'm working with a theater group that's trying to do a group of staged radio plays for charity, because we do this every year at Thanksgiving for the food bank. And we're actually having trouble because we have to get all the unions to agree that we're not going to be making any money off this, and all the money is going to go to charity. And it's hard. It's actually hard. They're not used to yet doing something. Oh, that's not on stage. That's on YouTube. So therefore, that needs to be handled by SAG-AFTRA. It's like, well, no, but we're doing it on stage. We're not even really on any stage, and so it gets very complicated. The social things have not met up with the technology things, especially nowadays. So it's very interesting. There's going to be some overturns, I think, in the near future.
But they never have. I mean, the social
No, I agree.
They've never caught up with what the theater wanted to do. There's always been absurd laws applied to the theaters.
Yep. If either externally or internally in this case.
Yeah. Well, for a long time, you couldn't use 3 actors. I mean, starting way back, the 3-actor rule of Greek theater is a late evolution. The first 20 or so tragedies we have were under the 2-actor rule.
Yes. Yeah, so that was probably a union thing, that way they could get their jobs.
No, but melodrama is why musicals are often, or straight plays rather than musicals, are often referred to as legitimate theater.
Mm-hmm.
You know that story?
No, I don't know why that happened. I just know that they don't consider musicals legit.
Henry Fielding, the great novelist who produced Tom Jones, started out as a playwright, and he was a satirist, and he was way too funny, and he was very funny on the subject of George I and George II.
Oh, well.
So it was decided that the Master of Revels, who was the chief censor in Britain at the time, would be overworked if he had to see what was going on in all the theaters. So they essentially said, okay, straight plays can be presented at 2 theaters, later expanded to 3, in all of England. Anything else, however, there's an exception. You can have spoken dialogue over a concert. Hence melodrama, music drama. So you could do anything as long as an orchestra was playing, which meant, of course, that there was that problem about hearing things, which meant, of course, that you got the buildup of doing more visual effects. Mm-hmm. And so by the 1790s, there were literally things written called carpentry pieces, where the orchestra would play as loud as possible to cover the sound of the special effects being built on the stage behind the curtain before the curtain came up for the next special effect. And there were so-called carpentry scene actors who were these poor devils whose job was to go out and tell jokes that nobody in the audience could hear to each other. So it's quite literally seen, in 18th and 19th century plays, there are lengthy scenes in which 2 ethnic stereotypes bellow jokes at each other as loudly as possible, because it doesn't matter. They just have to have the actors on the stage.
This probably led to mime.
And any number of other things, yes. And, again, that was a social accommodation, but it lasted until almost the turn of the 20th century. The American musical was an adaptation because English-speaking audience by then expected background music. Mm-hmm. And if you think that it didn't last, how many films have you seen without background music?
Well, even in the silent days, there were tons of background music, either from an orchestra, if you were in New York City. I think that the D.W. Griffith movie, Birth of a Nation, had a full orchestra for its silent movie, and then, or a piano. And I ran one of the last film programs at WorldCon back in what was it, 86, when it was in Atlanta. And we actually hired a pianist to come in and play for several silent science fiction movies that we brought in, mostly by Long and people like that in Murnau and things. So yeah, there's been music since the very beginning.
Indeed. Carrie?
interested to see what's going to happen with this whole adaptation trend. Especially for Broadway musicals, adapting movies, and it's not just Disney doing it, but, Legally Blonde, the musical, Shrek, the musical, these are some of the biggest, the biggest draws on Broadway back when we still had, live theater, which is a whole other issue there that I don't know that we want to get into.
No.
But I've seen people expressing frustration that there's not as much money there for original musicals and original plays, and I'm super kind of curious about the whole, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. Like, why a play? That didn't seem intuitive to me when it was announced and when it was staged, except that it was kind of this big event that they knew people would buy tickets for no matter what, which is what drives the whole adaptation thing anyway. It's familiar. People want things that are familiar, but I do wonder if it is taking away from original theater, original works for the stage, and what's going to happen with that if maybe things will swing back the other way.
And I think that it is very cyclical, because turning things into musicals has been happening for a long time. Going back to the operatic days, almost all of the major operas were based on stories or legends, and the Ring cycle is Lord of the Rings with sound, with singing. It really is. It's a huge thing, and so there's something about putting things to music that I think is very important to people, and you can have it both comedy and dramatic stuff. So you can go from Wagner to Cole Porter, and I think there's a lot I love musicals. I am totally into them, and I wish I could write music, or I would write more musicals.
I love musicals too, but I remember when they announced that Phantom of the Opera was coming out as a musical, and I said, wait a minute, what?
It's more of an opera, though. It's an actual opera.
At least it takes place at an opera. There's.
Well,
Yeah,
but still, it was like you take a horror story, and Phantom is a horror story.
There was a reason for Titanic,
Well,
there's more than one musical of Titanic. There's like at least two.
I know.
And
like what's next? The Black Death, the musical?
Wait, I've seen that.
Yeah,
it's at the beginning of Something Rotten, the Black Death musical. The Inquisition,
the musical.
Well, yes,
Mel Brooks.
And I think Monty Python did that too. But yeah, at the beginning of the play Something Rotten, which is a very funny Shakespearean play. It's about the competitor to Shakespeare, and they said the Black Death. So yeah,
and somebody said there's more than one musical version of Phantom of the Opera. But it's interesting that there seems to be a trend, and I don't know if it's a recent trend, but to make some of these lighter in certain ways. I mean, Titanic was a terrible tragedy, but we make it into a musical, and somehow that lessens. I mean, what's next? The Holocaust, the musical? Where do you stop?
I believe Mel Brooks already did that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Mel Brooks can get away with it.
Yes.
And the other thing that's interesting is that musical, there's an enormous tradition of original straight plays, but musicals have almost always come from some other source. The famous example is that for a very long time it was a fair question: had there ever been a successful musical that didn't have a source outside the theater? And the only answer to that was The Music Man. Meredith Willson apparently made that one up off the top of his head, and it's hard. There are some recent ones, and it depends on what you count. There are things like there have been a couple of fairly successful musicals based on tabloid crime stories. That's kind of hard to say whether that's but there's still a source. I mean, there's still something that happened.
Yeah.
Well, there's a source, but then there's I guess, transposing, and you know, especially like the big Disney movie thing, and transposing that to stage, and you know, just yeah, I don't know. It seems like that, you know, it's usually the other direction. You know, Broadway musicals getting made into movies, but that doesn't happen so much anymore. It's usually the other way around now.
Broadway productions cost more than movies, I think. That's been a big problem.
And they don't make as much money.
No, they can't. Well, they can't. You know,
Yeah.
they have to.
Well, Broadway was sort of the origin of the reason the theater got to be in New York was the road that originally, and the Syndicate and the Schubert Brothers, the Syndicate, theatrical syndicate, Charlie Frohman and that outfit, and the Schubert controlled chains of theaters that stretched all over the country. And but it was a syndicate. You know, the theater owner had some considerable power in what shows he was going to book. So there got to be a tradition of, in the fall, you bring in all the theater owners in the country to see the new shows in New York, because shows were mounted from New York for a bunch of reasons. And you know, and that preview season got to be something that the New York audience loved and lived for, and like that. And when the road died, you know, the Broadway was still there.
Yeah,
basically.
I think it was the bagels myself.
Well,
I was being able to get Chinese takeout at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Well, yeah, that too.
Yeah. Another interesting thing is, if you go back to the late 50s and early 60s, a lot of the television shows were shot in New York because they would use Broadway people who would perform the TV stuff in the afternoon. It would get edited, then they would go on stage at night. And a lot of soap operas were that way. Edge of Night, very famous soap opera. Dark Shadows used a lot of Broadway stage people, and just normal TV shows were shot there because of all the Broadway people. Eventually moved to Hollywood because television became a lot bigger budget. Because if you look at the 50s and 60s, a lot of that was really low budget video instead of shooting on film. And so, okay,
my friends, we are just about to wrap up. So let me get a final statement from each of you about horror, sci-fi, fantasy in the theater, and what you think is good about it, and where you think it might be going. And we'll start with John.
There ought to be lots of it. And since we were just on musicals, The Black Crook is the first 1869 first identifiable thing that really looks like a Broadway musical. And it was a fantastic, so I mean, it's a fantasy story. There's magic and evil witches and all the rest of it, and great big special effects. And it was actually thrown together because two producers had bought at a budget a bunch of costumes from Italy, a bunch of scenery from France, and a playwright who they promised could have the basically could have his money right away if he would get it done by Saturday.
I've seen this movie. It's called The Producers, but
okay, Bill.
Okay, well, I want to use my time to plug the fact that our plays will be performed right after this at it's 7 o'clock my time. I forget, it's 5 o'clock your time, I think, when it'll be performed. And it's the Headman, the Horseman of the Hollow. It's a version of the Sleepy Hollow story told in rural Georgia in the post-Civil War era, written by one of our local playwrights. And it's very good. And it's an interesting thing because it's an audio theater, but I cut together a lot of the photographs that we had taken of the actors performing on stage. So there's a visual track for you to look at too. It doesn't move much, but it's because it's all audio, but at least you have something to look at too. So I wanted to plug that.
Terrific. And please post that in the Neverland Discord channel so that people can find the link. And John, the same with your encyclopedia. And Carrie Vaughan.
I was just going to ask what channel we're on, because I'm going to try to find some links to that. The Fly opera.
We are on Neverland.
Yay. gosh, anything's possible. And it's like any other kind of writing. I don't know, we've got a bunch of theater people in our audience now, inexperienced, and I'm assuming people who are just interested in it. But that's on my list of things that I want to do. I have some plays that I want to write because of, I've got this theater background, and my brother basically has his own theater right now. Like, it's technically not his theater, but he kind of does. So, take those opportunities. Theater is the oldest form of entertainment, just about. And it's been around, and science fiction and fantasy and horror theater has been around since theater has been around. And the sky's the limit. I think just I don't know how to predict it, because it's always been here, and it just, cool stuff keeps happening. So we will overcome.
We will. We'll save the theatre. I watched a Shakespeare play that was done on a Zoom meeting a couple of months ago, and it was really fun. And it just goes to show that theatre people will not be quelled. We will get out there. We will perform. And I just want to say, if any of you guys need, say, an English accent.
Well, now that you mention it,
I'm very reasonable.
We pay absolutely nothing, but we have a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, make sure you message me. I want to say thank you to everybody. You were absolutely phenomenal. This was a really fun panel. I hope you enjoy the rest of your convention. Please check out Neverland on the Discord channel. And if you have any questions for the panelists, post them there, because they now know to go and have a look. They will post their links and resources for you to check out. And if you are interested, I'm going to be telling stories at 5:30 back here in this room. But I say thank you very much to our host, Jessie, and I say thank you very much to our panelists. You were fabulous. Yay!
Thanks, everyone.
Jazz hands.
That's my sister-in-law's license plate. She has a personal license plate that's jazz hands.
Jazz hands.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, she says the number of people who, she loves it every time.
Thank you, guys.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, there we go. So that was a very successful panel.